committed to excellence in teaching and research. And I should just add that he has done so much around sustainability at Tufts that I'm really thankful for his leadership in this area. I'm really delighted that you're with us today. And Tony, I turn the podium to you.
Well, thank you, Colin. With the fall semester just underway, this is a nice occasion for me to welcome everyone back, and those new to campus, welcome as well. I'm honored to be here for this inaugural Hoch Cunningham Environmental Lecture, which is part of a lecture series that will continue throughout the academic year. The resources that have made this lecture possible have also enhanced several aspects of the environmental studies program and have been provided by two generous alumni siblings who are with us today, Daphne Hoch Cunningham, A18P, and Roland Hoch, A85, A19P, and their families. Thank you so much for all that you've done. This support comes at an important time in the environmental studies program, as the number of students in the major has more than doubled in the last 5 years. As a result, lectures like this have become increasingly popular, and I can remember this series as the Lunch and Learn series, usually over in the Tisch College Rab Room. I don't know if it's moved locations, but I used to come a little bit in the beginning. I think this is responding to both student interest in this subject as well as the well-being of our environment. This year, the program is going to add a new major in Applied Environmental Studies. The program also continues to enhance programming that builds connections between the School of Arts and Sciences, the Friedman School, the Fletcher School, and other places that are hosting wonderful speakers like our guest today. We're very grateful to Professor Colin Oriens and Dr. Coco Gomez for their leadership of the program, and thank you to Daphne and Roland again for your commitment to help us grow this program and enhance the opportunities for our students, faculty, and the protection of the environment. I now invite Jim Glazer to say a few words. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. I have to say, I've been in this room many, many times. I don't think I've seen this many people in this room in 29 years, so it's really exciting to see. Thank you all for joining us for the inaugural Hoch Cunningham Environmental Lecture. This lecture series will continue throughout the academic year and beyond this academic year. And I had the opportunity to partner with Daphne and Roland to explore how they might support our educational efforts related to the environment and food systems, two areas that they are deeply passionate about. The Environmental Studies program has proved to be a really wonderful fit, and we're very thrilled with these results and the results that are to come. I want to do a shout out, President Monaco did as well, but one reason is the leadership of the Environmental Studies program and the Food Studies program, which is so strong and so committed. And I wanted to say publicly to Colin and to Coco that I'm grateful as Dean of the school that you're responsible for this fantastic program. I also want to extend my personal thanks to Roland and to Daphne and to their families. Your support of this lecture series, as well as the new academic programming and course development that will follow, will increase exposure to the fields of environmental science, food studies, food systems for the Tufts community. And this, of course, includes deepening our commitment with the Friedman School, which is there, but everything that helps connect us more is really, really valuable. And so thank you all again for coming, and it is my great pleasure to reintroduce Professor Oriens to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
So let me welcome you back to Thursdays at noon lectures. Feels a little weird to not call it the Lunch and Learn, but I love this new name, Hoch Cunningham Environmental Lecture. When I became director in 2010, starting this series was a really important milestone for me to sort of create a sense of community, introduce students in the community to the really variety of environmental careers that are out there. And I think we've accomplished that. And I think that the number of people here is a testament to the success of this program. So I could not be more pleased to know that Roland and Daphne share your enthusiasm and have decided to support this lecture. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Daphne, for this amazing generosity. It's really, really touching. With your support, we can now bring really amazing experts from the outside of the Boston area, and we put together a really exciting lineup. I hope you will all check it online. It's going to range from wind power next week to marine conservation to Antarctica, where we'll have an artist come and talk about her work. We encourage you all to come again and sign up for our mailing list. So I'm going to pass around a mailing list, and if you could sign up your name, you will get notified. Going forward, we will not be meeting here. We will be meeting in the Curtis multipurpose room, so I hope to see you there. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker for the inaugural Hoch Cunningham Environmental Lecture, Tamar Haspel. I met Tamar Haspel a few years ago when she came to a class that was a university seminar that was Friedman Arts and Sciences Provost-supported class. It was an amazing presentation, and I'm looking forward to welcoming her back to the Medford campus. She writes the monthly Unearthed column for the Washington Post and is a regular contributor to National Geographic's The Plate. Her articles explore issues around climate change and food, and her analysis is always really thought-provoking and really challenges your biases. She does a great job of embracing complexity. She does not look at the world through a simple lens. Today will be no different. She will challenge you to listen, to learn, and to change. As George Bernard Shaw said so eloquently, progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Tamar.
Did I turn that on successfully?
Yes, I did.
All right, we'll start this with a mic check. We're good? Good. Thank you, Colin and Coco. Thank you, Tuff. Thank you, Roland and Daphne, for making this possible. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to see such a crowd here, but don't think I don't know you're here for the food. And, but also don't think I'm not going to take advantage of that. So do I have a clicker? Thank you. Before we start, I have a question. And I don't ask rhetorical questions. I ask questions that I want answers to. When was the last time you changed your mind? And not like paper, plastic, you know, tuna or turkey wrap. An issue of substance. An issue that you argued with your family about. An issue that you took a stand about. And then you changed your mind. In the last year. Who's got one they want to share with the class? We'll start here. All right, we'll give you a pass just because. But right behind you. No? Who's got one they can talk about? Great. Mm-hmm. And so now you're a vegan? So we have somebody who went from not being a vegan to being a vegan, and it's a good story, and I'm going to hopefully remember to come back to it later. Anybody else want to share one? Okay. Now, part of it is that you don't want to talk in front of a crowd, but I also think we can conclude there's not an epidemic of mind changing going on. And most of you are students. Who's students? Non-students. Most of you are students, and let me tell you, these are the mind-changing years. If you're not changing your mind now, it's going to get harder, not easier, as you get older. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about climate change. We're also going to talk about mind changing. Because am I doing it wrong? I'm doing it right. For the record, I'm doing it right. I guess we can do it this way. All right, while we do that, when the first slide comes up, you'll see that what it says is, thank you. This is how we think we make decisions. Yeah, sorry, you guys can't see it over there. This is how we think we make decisions. This is how it feels like to us that we're making decisions. We're evaluating the situation. We're taking facts into account, and we are coming to a logical conclusion. That's what it feels like for all of us. But this is how we really do it. We have an elephant. And did anybody read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind? Anybody? How about Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow? Yeah, the same basic idea. Except I think Haidt's metaphor is the stickiest one. So Jonathan Haidt's metaphor is that we are all an elephant and a rider. And our elephant is the total of our gut, our instinct, our intuition, our values, our cultural affiliations. And when a controversial issue comes along, our elephant knows exactly what he thinks of it. And because climate change has become one of those controversial issues, it becomes this elephant-guided can of worms. Now, but there's also a rider. And your rider is the intellectual part. The rider is the thing that's supposed to be able to parse fact one and fact two and come up with a conclusion. And on a good day, that's what the rider does. But it turns out that cognitively, what the rider's job is to justify the direction that the elephant took in the first place. And so even though there's lots of disagreement about the subjects that we argue about, climate change, nuclear power, gun control, abortion, think about all of the hot-button issues, there's actually very little disagreement among the social scientists, not all social, some cognitive neuroscientists as well as psychologists who study this. It's pretty much well established that this is how the human brain works. And John Haidt's book is The Elephant and the Rider. Daniel Kahneman's book, System 1 and System 2, are analogous to The Elephant and the Rider. But we're all late to the party because Hume said it hundreds of years ago. Reason is slave to the passions. The ancient Greeks knew it. This is not a surprise. But the problem is that it's easy to see when other people's reason is subject to other people's passions. It's a lot harder to access it when it's your own. And we have a particularly diabolical way of making sure that our elephant gets fully supported by our rider. And confirmation bias rules the human psyche. Everything we do is geared toward making sure that we see and believe evidence that supports our worldview, and we don't see and don't believe evidence that doesn't support our worldview. And my favorite example is my friend Ursula. She thinks that everybody who drives a BMW is a jerk. And when you drive with Ursula and you get cut off by a BMW, she's like, see, BMW drivers are jerks. But somehow when you get cut up by a Porsche, she doesn't notice. Or when a BMW is driving perfectly responsibly, she doesn't notice that either. You only see the things that support your worldview. And there are two ways for this to happen. I'm sorry you guys see my butt all the time. But there are two ways for this to happen. One is that we search out the information sources that support us. And because this is a university, I'm going to guess the bias in the room probably leans left rather than right. And so, you know, the question of CNN or Fox, and also social media friends and actual friends, gets answered in one particular way. And there are a bunch of surveys like this about which media people on the right or the left support. And they all look pretty much like this. I like this one because it includes The Onion. So, what we have, we're starting with this landscape where people are getting their information from a self-selected news source that tends to give them the information that they want. And think about what you do on Twitter, on Facebook. Who are you friends with? You probably have some people who disagree with you in your feed, but when you look at their stuff, are you doing it out of curiosity, or is it more like reconnaissance to see how, like, the other side is thinking? But there's a more diabolical way that confirmation bias works, because we can't exclude all of the evidence that contradicts our worldview from our lives. We may try. But when that information comes our way, we evaluate it in the context of what we already believe. And one of the things that can happen is that facts that contradict your worldview can actually make you dig your heels in and believe that even more closely. And there are a number of psychologists who are studying this, and it's not universal. Sometimes it happens, and sometimes it doesn't. Brendan Nyan at Dartmouth is studying it. But the more diabolical one, and I think it plays out in every conversation about every controversial issue, is that we evaluate the credibility of experts based on the extent to which they agree with us. So a few years back, Dan Kahan at Yale did this really interesting study where he showed people these three experts, and you know they're experts because they're old white guys in suits, and they're, you know, of a certain age, and they all have essentially identical resumes. And he put words in their mouth about three controversial issues. The issues were climate change, gun control, and nuclear power, concealed carry. And what this chart shows is how people evaluated the credibility of those experts. So when the expert said climate change is high risk, 72% more of left-leaning people said he was credible than right-leaning people. And of course, it's the opposite going the other way. They're not evaluating the position. They're evaluating the credibility of the guy. And you do it by seeing how closely that person's views align with yours. Now, I'm a journalist. I call people all the time, and this scares the bejesus out of me, because how am I doing that? How am I evaluating people's credibility? Because, you know, the lesson here is that, yeah, this happens, but the thing that should scare you most is how it's happening to you. And so the net here is that facts are not persuasive. You can tell people just about anything about any subject, and it is unlikely to change their mind. And I'm going to go to this gentleman's story here about veganism. Talked with your friends, wasn't persuasive, and what kicked you over into the vegan side is your father's illness, something very personal, something that hit you in the gut. And I suspect that there are other people in the room who have similar stories about this. Now, there are exceptions to this. If you're new to a subject, or if a subject hasn't become associated with a particular identity that you have, then facts have some hope. But once you're established in these things, it's very, very difficult to penetrate with facts. So let's talk about climate change. So this is the percent of right-leaners, Republicans, Democrats, and independents who worry a great deal about climate change. And back in 2001, there was a gap. But as this problem became more and more urgent, that gap became bigger and bigger. Because in these intervening years, climate change became more than just climate change. Climate change became a badge of identity. If you're on the left, it's something that you think is very important, maybe the most important issue our planet is facing. If you're on the right, it's just part of a millennia-old trend of weather patterns. And once this split happens, it's very, very difficult to make it unhappen. Here's nuclear energy. And after Fukushima, you can see that even among Republicans, the confidence in nuclear energy has waned. But still, the gap persists. This has been another hot-button issue. If you're on the left, you oppose it. If you're on the right, you support it. How about renewables? It's the same thing. If you're on the left, you think that solar and wind are going to answer our climate problems. If you're on the right, you have no confidence in that solution. Everybody is looking at the same set of facts, yet we have this remarkable schism in what people believe. And this is a scary thing. Science doesn't protect you. And I talk to scientists all the time. And of course, the scientific method is made to try and get you to focus on facts. But so here's the sentence. I'm not pro-GMO or anti-GMO. I follow the science and go where it leads me. I have been told that essentially verbatim by two different people. One of them is Kevin Folta, who is a scientist at the University of Florida who got caught up in all kinds of industry mishigas, and is undeniable. He says he's not pro-GMO or anti-GMO, but he's emphatically pro-GMO. The other guy is Doug Gurian-Sherman. He also has a PhD. He's a senior scientist at the Center for Food Safety. He says he's not pro or anti. He is emphatically anti. Both of these gentlemen are well-educated, but both of them believe that they're following the science, and they follow them to opposite conclusions. But there's more. Education in general doesn't protect you. And I don't usually put long quotes up, but I want you to read that one because it's important. The net of it, for those who can't see, the net of it is that education just makes you way better at confirmation bias. It gives you more confidence in the idea that you held in the first place. And there's a lot of evidence for this dynamic. So here's global warming. There's solid evidence that global warming is due mostly to human activity. And so on the x-axis, we have science intelligence, just ordinary science knowledge, which is assessed by a test of just scientific facts. And then the probability that you agree that global warming is due mostly to human activity. Among people who don't know much about science, they're about the same. But the more you know about science, the more your political identity, your political identity drives what you think about this. The more confident you are to assert that, yes, it's a problem if you're a Democrat, and no, it's not a problem if you're a conservative. And it's really hard to make sense of this because intuitively it seems all wrong to us. If you understand science, shouldn't you be able to parse this better? So let's look at another chart. Human beings developed from an earlier species of animal. Look for a second at the similarity between those charts. Obviously, the thing that determines whether you believe that has nothing to do with science. It's religiosity. And it's people who are very religious who tend to believe this thing. And I don't think anybody really questions that link because it makes sense to us. Religion is a value. And your participation in the community is really important to you. Whether humans developed from an earlier species of animal doesn't really make any difference to your life. But your membership in a church and your buy-in to a community where you raise your children, where you spend your time, where you are welcome, that matters a lot to you. And so, of course, values will trump science in this particular instance. But why wouldn't it be true for global warming as well? It's exactly the same dynamic. It's just in the realm of the public sphere where it makes less intuitive sense to us than in a religious sphere. I want to talk about agriculture because this is where some of these climate change conversations are playing out, because we're watching as farmers are affected by storms, by changing weather, by droughts, by temperature changes. Yet farmers are notorious in not acknowledging climate change and human activity. And this is also a part of my beat, so it's something that I've spent a lot of time on. So let's look at the political landscape here. Farmers are overwhelmingly Republican. And not just Republican, they're Midwestern, most of them. They're America's heartland. They tend to be white. They tend to be religious. And ranchers are about the same. Now let's look at the people who are talking about and writing about climate change. Let's look at activists. Well, they're overwhelmingly Democrats. They're overwhelmingly coastal, urban as opposed to rural. Journalists, here we are. Yet we are the people, we here are writing about those guys there. What are the odds we get this wrong? As a journalist, I would say they're damn high. And it's an easy thing to get wrong. And I go out and I see farmers. I visit farms a lot. And I go to Iowa and I go to the farm of somebody who is white. And I don't know his politics, but I can, the odds are Republican, church-going, and heartland-based, community-based. Here I am. Let's face it, everything about me screams New York Jew. And I'm standing talking to this guy. I'm aware of our differences. I'm aware that he's aware of our differences. I'm also aware that he knows this dynamic, that the press doesn't understand farmers. They're, a bunch of coastal elites. And here I am. I write for one of those elite media outlets. I'm so coastal my socks are damp. And how do I make sure we have a constructive conversation? And I try to find something we can talk about. And I have a farm. He has a farm. We can talk about that. I also hunt. I eat meat, and I think the most responsible way to eat meat is to cull overpopulated deer herds. And so I have a friend in Virginia. I go and shoot a deer, and that's the meat that we eat. And so I have a picture of me with a deer. And from hunting, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump. You can talk about guns. And if you can talk about guns, you can talk about anything. And so, and it's not, it sounds like it's a party trick, Hey, look at my Tika 270. But it's not. It's a bona fide way to establish that, hey, we're not as different as maybe it looks like. So this made news a couple of years ago. The USDA said that people should stop using the phrase climate change and instead use the phrase weather extremes, partly because exclusively because talking about climate change immediately puts up a wall with farmers. Now, it's hard to look at this and decide whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. But I want to know what you think. Is this a good idea? No takers, 5 takers, 6 takers. Bad idea. Come on. Undecided. Yeah, I was undecided about it. Yeah, there we go. That's how I was. And at first I thought it was a bad idea. Because it's like, if we can't talk about this thing that's so important, in the terms that everybody uses, what hope is there to solve the problem? But I have come around, and I will admit it's kicking and screaming, I've come around to the view that it's actually a good idea. And I hate that it's a good idea, but I still think it's a good idea, because we have to learn to meet other people where they are. We have to be able to talk in ways that don't put up any more barriers than we already have, because we got a ton of barriers going in, and you don't need more than you already have. Is it science, or is it values that are driving these things? And I hope by now everyone would say, values, give me a V. But I want to put this in a little bit of perspective. So if you're like me, you can understand this intellectually, but it feels wrong. We all still feel like we are rational decision makers. And, you know, my job is to sift through facts and tell people what's true. And if humans really suck at that, that is very scary, also livelihood threatening. But think about it this way. So this is human history. The first hominid appeared, what, 6 million years ago? And that doesn't even count all the time that we became hominids, you know, after we crawled out of the primordial ooze. We've had billions of years of evolution to make this happen, to develop our cognitive abilities, to develop our decision-making apparatus. And science comes along basically yesterday. Is it so surprising that we're no good at incorporating spreadsheets into our decision-making process? It shouldn't be, because we've had millennia of time to optimize decisions for the personal, for the tribal, for the intuitive. That's how our intuition developed. You only have to see a saber-toothed tiger come out of the bushes once to be afraid of every rustle of those bushes. Now, can we tell you what are the odds that a saber-toothed tiger is going to come out of the bushes when they rustle? It's probably really, really slim. And if we were having this argument today, we'd have debunkers coming out saying, hey, you know, the odds of being afraid of the saber-tooth. But you just have to see it once to know that it makes sense to protect yourself, even if it never happens again in your lifetime, because then you can teach their children. And that day the saber-toothed tiger does come out of the bushes, you're good. And so a decision-making apparatus that is optimized for a time when we didn't have data, when we didn't have science, when we didn't communicate beyond our small worlds, it's really, really bad at incorporating the things that now we call science. And you know, there's another aspect of history that I think helps put this in context. If we think about where science was 400 years ago, we're like, oh, those poor schlubs. They had to have, you know, surgery with no anesthesia. They wore bird masks to ward off the plague. They treated everything with bloodletting. We're like, oh, those poor schlubs. But 400 years from now, we're the schlubs. We're the poor schlubs. What about our world? Are people 400 years from now going to say, oh, look what they thought? Do you really think that there's nothing about our understanding of climate change that is going to prove to be wrong in 400 years? That's not to say it's not happening. Nobody here, well, probably nobody here is a climate denier. But we probably don't have a super sophisticated understanding of some of these dynamics. And I think it behooves us to go out in the world with circumspection. And, you know, all of this, every time I talk about this, somebody asks the question, but aren't there some things that are true? Yeah, there are definitely some things that are true. There are some things we can say we really are pretty sure about. You know, gravity, we're good. Evolution, okay, I'll go with that. I'll go with the climate is changing and human impact is causing it. I'll even go with GMOs are safe to eat. But certainty has a bad case of mission creep. And to go from these sort of blanket statements, these are things we know, and apply them to the granular arguments we start having about, you know, storm intensity or methane release, things get a whole lot dicier. And I know a very respected academic who tweeted about how hurricane landings in the United States hadn't increased over the years. And he got labeled a climate denier out in the world. And, you know, if you Google me, you'll find there are hit pieces on me because I don't think GMOs are bad enough. I just think they have some downsides. And so these things become toxic, partly because we extend the certainty that we have about these large phenomena, and they filter down into our day-to-day discussions about the minutia of some of these issues. And so you'll find it in nuclear power where people talk about, you know, waste disposal. You find it in climate change on all sorts of things. You find it on GMOs with, you know, arcane details of pest control. And so it's really important to separate the things, yeah, we know, from the things maybe we're not so sure about. And so because it's my job to understand facts and to communicate them to people, this is my journalistic challenge number one, is to try and figure out how I can do better understanding where I go wrong, ensuring I'm not climbing down my own rabbit hole. And there's not a lot of research on how people do this better. And I'm not wholly convinced that there can be, because I think that when you put people in a lab situation, you have different dynamics going on. And so I'm going to tell you what I do, but I want to emphasize that this is my cranky personal list. These are things that I have employed to try and do this better. And I think they probably have some applicability for others. But I want to hear your ideas, too. And I'm leaving a lot of time for questions because I would like this to become a conversation. So here we go. Number one, believe in your elephant. And it's hard to do because it doesn't feel like we have one. And of course, if we could access our elephants, we'd all summon them and give them a good talking to. But we can't, and so we don't. And I would encourage you to read John Haidt's book. It's a very good book, and it's very illuminating about how we have these conversations. And it was written, I think, in 2012 or something, so before climate change really became super toxic. So there's not a lot about climate change, but there is about other issues. And because none of this is going to make any sense to you, none of this is going to be compelling to you unless you really believe that this is a dynamic that happens with you. Number two, assume good faith. That's Vandana Shiva. Do you guys know who Vandana Shiva is? A couple of you. So Vandana Shiva is an Indian activist, and she did actually a very compelling movie about soil called Dirt. And but she is very convinced that GMOs are bad in every way. And she has been going around the world asserting that they contributed to farmer suicides in India, a point that is actually, it's empirical and it's false. And I have the argument with people all the time about whether Vandana Shiva is lying. And people say, she's lying. She's seen the data. She's lying. But the nature of how we think is such that it's much, much easier for us to persuade ourselves that something is true than to lie every day. And so if she is heavily invested in this idea, she is going to see all of the evidence that supports it. She's going to dismiss all of the evidence that contradicts it, and she's going to stick to her guns. And when we go out in the world and we talk to people who are taking a position that is so clearly not in line with the evidence, like how about those guys who are New Earth creationists? It's hard to see how they can hold that position. And there's a journalist named Will Storr. He's very good, and he wrote a book called The Unpersuadables. And that was a UK title. I think it had a different title in the United States. And it was a number of years ago. And he went out and he talked, I mean, we think climate deniers. How about, Holocaust deniers and New Earth creationists, people who've taken rides on UFOs, things like that. He talked to people who believed these completely untenable things. And he said he went in with this idea that, of course, you just show them the evidence. And they'll say, oh, silly me. Of course the Holocaust exists. And what he found was that, of course, they had this well-defended series of responses to these things because, of course, they've seen them all before. And the lesson here is that however wild it seems, I think most people are operating in good faith. This is what they really believe. And so to assume that they're lying, although obviously some people are invested in a position and they go out in the world deliberately to seed misinformation. But most people are arguing in good faith. And if you remember that, it's a little easier to have sort of a kinder, gentler idea about this. There's me with my deer. Work from common ground. Now, that picture stands me in very good stead in Iowa, but I would never use it in this room, except to make a point, because I'm guessing that some people are put off by this. This is a picture of an animal I just shot. And you have a visceral response to it. And because you have a visceral response to it, you have a visceral response to me. And it's going to make it that much harder for us to talk about something else, even if we have more common ground on that issue. This is going to put up a wall between us. So try and find where you have commonality with people before you talk about differences, or while you're talking about differences. And I think a lot of this is ill-suited to online interaction because you don't know people. You know a Twitter handle. You know a Facebook feed. And it's one of the reasons, and it should probably be in this talk. Now, I always think of the thing I left out. Face-to-face matters a lot. And one of the reasons I do a lot of speaking in the public sphere is I think bringing people with diverse views into the same physical room is much more important than trying to communicate over media, because you can just turn the page, you can just scroll past. But if you're sitting in the bar at a conference with somebody and you figure out, both your kids, canoe and you both like Zoolander or whatever it is, that then all of a sudden this person who believes this thing that is anathema to you is approachable, and that makes the position approachable as well. So work from common ground. Oops. Find the smartest person who disagrees with you and listen. This is my cardinal rule as a journalist. I mean, I've been writing about food and agriculture for, oh God, I can't even say. And of course, I have views about something going in to any issue. I've been following it for 25 years, so yeah, I don't go in with a blank slate. I know what I think. And the first thing I do is find, okay, who's the smartest person I can think of who disagrees with me? And so I was writing about potatoes. And I'm pro-potato. And we all know that Walter Willett is anti-potato. He's probably the smartest guy who's anti-potato. And by the way, if I had been anti-potato, I would have called Marion Nessel, who's pro-potato. And so I had a long conversation with Walter Willett about potatoes. But the problem with being a journalist is then you're going to write about potatoes, and here you are, you barely squeaked through undergraduate, and you have to disagree in print either with Marion Nessel or with Walter Willett. And that's a really sucky part of my job, by the way. And so, but I disagreed with Walter Willett. I put in everything he said, and then I said why I thought why he had come to his conclusion. And he was incredibly gracious. He sent me a nice note. and an inscribed copy of his book, Nutritional Epidemiology. But it's really easy to dig in your heels on your own argument when you're talking to people you don't really respect. It's a lot harder when you're talking to somebody who's smarter than you. Identify the other side's strongest points. That's my dad. He died a few months ago, and the world is a slightly less argumentative place. Because my dad would take any side of any argument just for the pleasure and the intellectual exercise of hashing it out. So if you've ever wondered how I became a world-class irritant, I come by it naturally, because that is a very irritating characteristic. But I learned, I internalized as a kid that most arguments have two reasonable sides. And you find that, you'll find that if you identify the other side's strongest arguments rather than shooting down their straw men over and over and over, and how many times have you seen in print or on Twitter, XYZ believes this believable thing about climate change or GMOs or nuclear power, but XYZ also believes ridiculous thing about climate change. And they go immediately to the ridiculous thing without addressing the reasonable thing, because it's way more fun to deal with the ridiculous thing. But go through the exercise of making the argument that you do not hold. And more than that, if you see somebody making the argument you do not hold cogently, well, articulately, in an interesting way, put it out there in the world and say, all right, this isn't my view, but it's a really good statement of a view I don't hold. There's a guy in the UK, Anthony Warner, he's the angry chef on Twitter, and he wrote a book about fat. I disagree with him up and down about this book, but I think he's a really smart guy, and this was the best articulation of this argument that I've ever seen. And so I put a whole stream on Twitter about how great I thought it was, even though I didn't agree with it. And if we give that kind of respect to the arguments we don't have, I think it goes a long way toward improving discourse. Vet your sources. Who are you really listening to? Manage your media. Where are you getting your ideas about things? Are you going to places that reinforce them, or are you really exposing yourself to different kinds of points of view? You can start this by following me on Twitter, and we'll go from there. Number 7, drop anti-science from your vocabulary. Drop science denier. Drop climate denier. This is the Creation Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. It is devoted, and it's not the only institution, devoted to the science that supports New Earth creationism. And I remember being in a car on the West Coast driving up to the coast in Oregon, and I heard an interview on NPR, and I came in mid-interview, and the guy was saying, we really want to just put the evidence out there and let people decide for themselves. It was only at the end I realized it was New Earth creationism. And my point here is that every person since the dawn of time has believed that the facts support her conclusion. Nobody says, well, the facts really support this other conclusion, but I have this conclusion anyway. And when you call somebody anti-science, you're really saying you're an idiot. You're saying you don't understand how to parse the world around you, and I do. So even if they actually are anti-science, you get nowhere when you do this. It's an insulting term, but more importantly, it's an inaccurate term. And the fight about GMOs really highlights this. Also, the fight about vaccines, where it seems like people who are anti-vax, people who are anti-GMO, are not paying attention to the science. But what they would say is, you poor suckers, You think that what passes for science is disinterested. You don't think it's rigged. You don't understand how power plays into this. There is science. The science that supports me is the science that's true. And if that's the case, if you're anti-vaccine and you believe it's because, Big Pharma has rigged the system, calling somebody anti-science just makes it absolutely impossible that anybody will move. Reach across the aisle. My solution to sort of political polarization is to make Congress sit Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, instead of having their separate aisles like this. I think that would make them talk to each other. But it happens in real life, too. Where are you spending your time? Do you have friends who disagree with you? My full disclosure, my politics, I'm a left-leaning centrist. I have dear friends who voted for Trump. And not only do I not recoil in horror, I value having people with radically different ideas about the world in my sphere, because it makes me circumspect when they're around, and even when they're not around. So how often do we go in a group and we're confident that the group agrees with us, and, can you believe those guys who deny climate change? And you roll your eyes. But would you do that if half the room was farmers from Iowa? My guess is that you wouldn't, because even a modicum of respect for humans would stop you from doing that. We only express our opinions in those ways when we're surrounded by like-minded people. And that's the difficulty with being surrounded by like-minded people. Hang out with other people. So that's my list, and there's one more that I want to add, and that's to be kind. Two things happen when you're kind. The first is the world's a nicer place. But the second is you give yourself cover to change your mind. The meaner you are to people who disagree with you, the harder it's going to be for you to change your mind, because you've painted yourself in a corner. Changing your mind starts with softening, and kindness helps with softening. And none of this is to suggest that people who think that the climate is changing and it's caused by humans and it's an urgent problem, you don't have to think that's wrong. I think that's right. But it doesn't mean that anything gets accomplished when you go out in the world with that as your flag and you plant it in the ground. And so when we talk about communication, I guess there are just a couple things I want to leave you with. One, remember, facts don't persuade people. And so when you have people in their trenches of their positions lobbing facts over the parapets, nothing gets accomplished except you extend the war. And it's really hard to stomach the idea that facts don't persuade people. Here you guys are, you're getting an education to learn, presumably, facts. And to find that they're all but irrelevant to public discourse is very disconcerting. But you have to believe it, because nothing changes until you do. The good news is that people persuade people. And this is why what you do in public is so important. This is why it's so important to be with people who don't all think like you. This is why it's so important to manage what you say out in the world, because this is how minds change. People persuade people. And when we go out in the world, all of us, we think that, we have the line to truth. And if I were to ask you, how many of you think that you're right about everything? Probably a couple hands would go up. But probably most people wouldn't say that. But then if I were to say, okay, well, what are you wrong about? And you start inventorying your positions, and damn if they don't all seem spot on. And so we all acknowledge in the abstract that we're wrong about things, but we all have a whole lot of trouble tapping into those things that we're wrong about. But if somebody could come to you and tell you, Jim, I'm here to tell you the things you're wrong about. I mean, and if that were possible, I think every one of us would be like, yeah, please, I know I would. Yet when we go out in the world, our aim is to persuade other people. And so think about persuasion differently. Don't focus on being so persuasive. Focus on being persuadable. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar. We have time for a few questions.
Questions, comments, other people's strategies.
I'm going to bring the speaker, the microphone to you. I'll try.
Thank you so much. Wonderful talk. I have a question about maybe, say, problems with urgency. I have a feeling like stuff like this would take some time in order to do it properly. And how does this either adapt or not adapt if there's something that has to be done quickly?
Yesterday, right.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And, you know, the problem with urgency is that it probably makes these dynamics worse rather than better. So it's a very difficult thing to solve. And I think that the way to deal with a problem that needs an immediate solution is to try and get people of good faith in the same room to talk about this. So you have this spectrum on every controversial issue. And, you know, the people on the ends probably aren't going to be very helpful. You want the people who disagree in the center to get together and then disseminate solutions back to the end. And again, I think it's face-to-face. It's face-to-face. Question in the back.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm wondering if you have ideas about how to maybe systematize this sort of thing, because it is a lot of effort to do both on a personal level and, you know, maybe some of us in this room will go out and do it, but if it's a lot of effort, I don't know that we can count on everybody doing it. Because people are
it's a really good question, and I don't think it really lends itself to systemizing, partly because I think it's something that's very hard to study, partly because it's individual. And I guess, you know, the thing about it is that when I give talks like this, people are often like, okay, well, how about those guys? How can we make them who disagree with me do this? And I feel like a therapist is like, you can't change your mother. And you can only change yourself. And so you know, in some way, it's totally kumbaya, this idea that if we all try and do this better, discourse improves. And it's a long shot, but I don't see the alternative. Thank you. Yes?
There's also motivated reasoning.
Right, that's exactly what this is, motivated reasoning.
Upton Sinclair quote, right? It's very hard to convince somebody of something when their salary depends upon it. And there are a number of people on nuclear power, guns, religion, climate change, who have spent billions of dollars supporting their argument, even when they know it to be untrue and false.
Do they?
Yes, they do. Naomi Oreskes will tell you that there are a whole bunch of people who do that.
There are some, certainly.
Yeah. So what you've talked about is in a perfect world, but we're not in a perfect world.
Not.
So how do you deal with the complexity of people who are paid to obfuscate?
Very difficult. And, you know, I think that in the world of journalism, I think, and also in the world of science, financial conflicts of interest, I think, have gotten a lot of attention recently. And I think that can go a long way if we have standards of transparency for these things And I face this myself because I speak to groups, and sometimes I go to conferences and speak at conferences that are partially underwritten by an industry group. And I have to safeguard my own conflict of interest, and my first rule is disclose everything I do. And I think having a community standard of disclosure is one way to do that. But the flip side of that is that in my travels, I do see a lot of people who have a position consistent with whatever it is that pays their bills. But don't make the mistake of underestimating ideological bias that can be just as powerful and motivating. And so in some ways, I don't think of financial conflict as all that different cognitively from an ideological, from motivated reasoning, for other motivations. Because in some ways, it doesn't really matter what brought you to this position where your heels are dug in and your confirmation bias is firing on all cylinders. What matters is that you're there. And I think some of the same strategies apply. But I agree with you, it's a very difficult problem.
Maybe we could have one more question, and then we will close. Oh, I have to go back over there. Just for those of you who are considering needing to leave to get to class, we're doing this as a zero-waste effort. So please, on your way out, follow the signs and compost what can be composted so we can keep this as zero waste as possible. Did I just go by?
Yes.
Thought so.
Hi. So I had a little throwback Thursday moment here. When I was the age most of the people in this room are, my professor asked me if we would have made more progress calling it climate change as opposed to global warming.
Mm-hmm.
Extreme outliers would get the job done, even though I'm confident in climate change. But what's next along this path?
You have to end on a question that I just don't know the answer to, because I don't. I think that I don't know that there is a hard and fast what's next. I think this is, as you have followed it, as it's changed, and it went from global warming to climate change, and now there are different arguments being made, there are different tropes, there are different ways that communities are being affected, and that becomes part of the conversation. I don't think we can predict it. I think it's organic. I think it's hard to direct. I think it's organic, and hopefully we'll all live to see its resolution. Thank you.
Thank you again for coming. Thank you, Roland. Thank you, Daphne, for your wonderful gift. Thank you, Jim, for facilitating this, and everybody in advancement. Thank you, the audience.
EMB 5 students come to the front.